Now, let's talk about some big concepts. We've already had a basic overview of various fields of critical theory, structure, and discourse. Let's talk about applying some of this stuff to film. We'll start by talking about documentary film, followed by authorial bias, film as a medium for social activism, and briefly discuss film as fine art. Here are two terms that probably you've heard before: objectivity and subjectivity. If we define these in terms of something like data collection or science, objectivity is anything presented without the human bias. Subjectivity is just the opposite, something filtered through the human bias. Of course, there's no such thing as purely objective or subjective information, just a scale between the two. For example, something like math or engineering falls closer to the objective side of the spectrum. In basic forms of math, calculations have objective answers. 2 plus 2 in most cases is 4. Of course, at high levels of mathematical theory, these relationships become less concrete. But for our example, 2 plus 2 is always 4. In engineering, a mechatronic device or structure either works or it doesn't. And the success of that function is then based on the axiomatic objective truths that serve as the foundation of construction. Alternatively, science and literary theory are somewhere in the middle of the scale. Scientific fact is created by repeated experimentations with repeated results. However, the hypothesis and experimentation methodology are all the choice of the experimenter. In literary or cultural studies, we make a thesis and support that thesis with research-based evidence. That research enters a larger conversation until the community, through the peer review process, determine which thesis and conclusions are the most credible. On the far side of subjectivity of things, we have something like art or propaganda. Art, for instance, is the artist's interpretation of something in the natural world, or an abstraction of some interpretation. Again, this is a big debatable definition that has been simplified for our purposes. Propaganda is a mode of rhetoric meant to manipulate the reader or viewer to the ideological side of the speaker. Therefore, it's not only steeped in subjective bias, but actively using this bias to deceive the individual or group consuming the propaganda. The history of film is steeped in debate on the nature of objectivity and subjectivity as well. Documentary and entertainment. We've already talked about how film shares a lot of history with theater, but it also shares a lot of its aesthetic history with photography. Specifically, this term verisimilitude, or the appearance of being true or real. In the late 1820s, when photography was introduced to the public, its verisimilitude was so great, really, that we've had yet to reconcile with its representational closeness to nature. Unlike painting, as Marcel Proust explains, the photograph lacks a certain thickness of art. Unlike a painting, the apparatus of the camera was thought to instill the photograph with a high level of objectivity. For this reason, the earliest uses of the photograph were what was called documentary photography. Photographs were taken of natural phenomenon as a method of data collection for scientific research. Later, the photograph becomes a means of capturing images of human beings or portraits. Because of its previous use as a medium for documentary, people perceived these portraits to be a true representation of the person captured within the photograph. However, if we think about this a little bit more, it's not quite true. For example, some of you all may have a photograph of your grandparents at your age. Are these accurate representations of your grandparents? The answer is no. Or if they were, how would you know? Your grandparents probably don't look the same as they did then, now, and you probably weren't even alive to meet your grandparents at your age. A photograph is just light captured in silver emulsion. And a digital photograph is just a collection of computer code that doesn't even exist as a visual thing until that code is recalled by the computer. So unless your grandparents are made from computer code or emulsion, the photograph is not an accurate representation. This, of course, wasn't the conclusion that earlier photographic viewers came to. Its closeness to nature and its ability to capture images of human beings turned out to be a terrible combination. In the 1880s, as the Russian Empire began expelling Jewish citizens from Kiev and other parts of its territory, France experienced a large influx of people seeking refuge, and as always happens in those situations, those refugees were perceived as second-class citizens by the French. For this reason, there were policies of systematic racism enacted by the French military and police as a way of controlling these new populations. In 1894, the French military falsely accused a Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, of treason to hide a crime committed by one of the high-ranking officials. This decade-long scandal would later be known as the Dreyfus Affair. During Dreyfus's trial, a man named Alphonse Bertillon would use photographic evidence to ultimately convict Alfred Dreyfus. The images of a forged document were doctored, and because of the perceived objectivity, the evidence was mocked, but not questioned by the prosecution. Years prior to the affair, Bertillon created a system of classifying criminality using photography, in which he would take images of people arrested for crimes, photograph them, and catalog the photographs for future use, thus engraving criminality onto the person being photographed. Bertillon's goal was to collect enough photographic data as a way of profiling criminality. You can probably see where this is going. The French police system already had an institutionalized racial bias that was introduced into Bertillon's data collection. So the ethnic minority groups being cataloged were often committed or arrested just on the grounds of this biased photographic evidence. Eventually, Bertillon began measuring and photographing the size of people's noses, the size of their ears, and other biological differences. Photography had one major flaw. It could capture still images of physical features, but it couldn't capture their movements or a sequence of images. So with the invention of film, Bertillon began using moving images that couldn't be blurred by an unruly suspect, and these archives of images became more efficient at engraving criminality on the body of the individual. If you think back to early film, cliches like the mustache-twisting character tying a woman to train tracks, or James Bond villains like Baron Samedi or Dr. No, they're often portrayed by traditionally othered ethnic groups. This is most certainly the holdover from the early history of Bertillon's invention, the mugshot. If we think back to Sherlock Jr., even in the 1920s, filmmakers seemed to be aware of this fact. During the first sequence where Buster Keaton is searching for his lost dollar, he seems intimidated by the man with the beard who is framed in a close-up. He's intimidated because this man shares some of the physical features with the same criminality Bertillon had cataloged. The joke in the sequence is that the man is just looking for his wallet, and Keaton was wrong to be intimidated by him. And another example, Max Schreck's portrayal of Count Orlok in 1922's film Nosferatu has overtones of anti-Semitism because of the added horror it provided to its white German audience during the interwar period as the seeds of Nazism were first being planted. We still see the same problems show up in contemporary film as well. Count Olaf, in A Series of Unfortunate Events, being an obvious homage to Nosferatu's Orlok. Likewise, the goblins at Gringotts in the Harry Potter films share some of the same anti-Semitic stereotypes popularized during the Dreyfus Affair period in France. This is all just one major example of perceived objectivity becoming a problem in film. Each topic in this final section is going to somewhat point back to this problem. In documentary film, for example, we're told that documentary means something is an accurate representation of reality, when in reality it's not. It's only the filmmaker's personal reading of reality, history, current events, cultural issue, or whatever else. While watching The King of Kong, think about genres of documentary and how it is still using a lot of the tropes of fictional cinematography to create a narrative. For example, in The King of Kong, we have a good guy, Steve Wiebe, and a villain, Billy Mitchell. Even though we know in the real world is never quite as black and white, and the film events are shown in chronological order, but like our early examples, for the Kuleshov effect, there's no obvious evidence that they were filmed in that order. How can the filmmakers, cinematographers, be with Billy in Florida and Walter Day in Iowa at the exact moment that Walter calls Billy? Moreover, think about how the characters are filmed. Billy is always standing in front of a messy desk or a hot sauce factory, whereas Steve is in a classroom or at home in front of the mountains in Seattle. These things don't necessarily mean the film is fake. It's just the way in which the story is being told, the discourse of the documentary. Different types of documentary use different types of discourse. The King of Kong is what we would call an observational documentary, or a documentary in which the filmmakers are observing and recording events and interviewing witnesses. Something like a Ken Burns documentary is what we call a factual film, in which research is being presented to the audience without much active human interaction. Keep in mind, factual films have a bias as well. For example, a documentary about the American Civil War, produced by the Daughters of the Confederacy, is going to be similar visually, but wildly different than one produced by a Hollywood studio or independent documentarian for PBS. While they both may be considered factual films, even though the Daughters produced film is most certainly falling closer to propaganda, to the propaganda side of subjectivity scale. Next, you have a participatory documentary. These are documentaries like Bowling for Columbine or Tickled, where the events are documented by a filmmaker who is interacting with the people being interviewed or acting in the role of an investigative reporter. Most participatory documentaries are going to have a strong filmmaker bias, but that bias is normally out in the open and not trying to manipulate the viewer. In the same line of film, a performative documentary like some Super Size Me or My Scientology movie are documentaries where the filmmaker is not only presenting their bias, but are a subject of their own examination. In Super Size Me, the filmmaker is the one eating the McDonald's food and talking about it. In My Scientology movie, the filmmaker, Louis Theroux, is making himself a target of Scientologists to show how they react to criticism. Next up, you have what's called a persuasive film, or a film where the documentary is presenting information in such a way as to convince the viewer of their bias. Something like Blackfish and The Cove are examples of persuasive documentaries. They're both presented as factual films or observational documentaries, but are being used as tools for activism to convince the audience that dolphin farming is cruel. And finally, we have propaganda films. These are documentary films that systematically disseminate deceptive or distorted information to manipulate a viewer. Leni Riefenstahl's 1935 film Triumph of the Will is an emblematic example of a propaganda film. Triumph takes the form of an observational documentary that is merely observing and recording the events of the Nazi Party's Nuremberg rally in 1934. The film has high swooping aerial shots and huge crowds of soldiers and followers instilling the idea of German patriotism into the viewers. However, in reality, large portions of the film were staged. Some of the crowds consist of cutouts and mannequins. However, the message stuck, and we think about the images in Riefenstahl's film whenever we think about a Nazi rally. When in reality, none of it comes close to accurately representing reality. Likewise, if you're familiar with movies like Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers, RoboCop, or Total Recall, you're familiar with this type of propaganda and satire. Americans were producing similar stuff shortly after Triumph of the Will, specifically Frank Capra's series of films, Why We Fight, that were created for the same purpose as Riefenstahl's film, to create an image of American patriotism as a way of convincing children to murder other children for the benefit of their country. Next up in this final module is what we call the author function as it relates to filmmaker bias. At this point, you've watched some or all of Annie Hall. Like films like Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Annie Hall are clearly focalized through a character, Alvy Singer in Annie Hall, Ferris Bueller in his movie, who appears to be in control of the film's narrative fabric. Terms like breaking the fourth wall may come to mind. A fourth wall break is when a character addresses the audience through the visual plane of a film. As we previously discussed, breaking the fourth wall comes from a theatrical tradition, where an actor might address the audience in an aside or a soliloquy. The purpose of this trope was to provide context to an audience that might not be available within the expositional segment of the first act. For example, in Shakespeare's Richard III, the "now this is the summer of our discontent" soliloquy establishes the setting of the play for a Tudor English audience. The play is set in the final years of the Plantagenet dynasty, so the speaker, Richard III, being a Plantagenet, establishes himself as the hobbled antagonist of the play. Alternatively, in Ferris Bueller's Ferris third wall breaks are there to illustrate Ferris's narrative bias and to provide the viewers with the framework to understand Cameron, another character's anxiety at the opening of the film. The wall breaks in Annie Hall are used for similar reasons. Alvy Singer isn't a dynamic character. He never changes throughout the film. Therefore, to illustrate Annie's emotional maturation, Alvy is offering himself as a benchmark for comparison. If we had to pick an antagonist within the film, Alvy would probably be that antagonist. Like Richard III, he all but tells the audience this in the first 30 minutes of the film. Moreover, by the end, he even demonstrates his own biases, ability to manipulate the way in which the story is being told. This is how the fourth wall is being used in Annie Hall, but what are the connotations of this style choice? For one, Annie can subvert the control of her narrator and Woody Allen, by playing Alvy, has further blurred the barrier between reality and the fictional world of the film. After reading Roland Barthes' Death of the Author and Foucault's What is an Author, you should see where I'm going with this. Can we then read Alvy Singer as reflecting his character, or can we read Woody Allen as reflecting his character? Both Barthes and Foucault are dealing with the shortcomings of structuralism in France that had been occupied by Nazis decades earlier. In literal terms, they're trying to develop a way of examining a text that likewise eliminates the shortcomings of their Nazi sympathizing peers, like Martin Heidegger, who was one of the key figures in development of the ontological metaphysics that really defined contemporaneous discussion of interwar modernist literature at the time. Alternatively, from a figurative perspective, Barthes and Foucault are also trying to remove the individual author's panoptic control in favor of a more meaningful cultural reading of the text. This cultural reading of the text focuses on the reader's interpretation as opposed to some mysterious authorial reading of the text. For example, knowing Jeffrey Jones was convicted of possessing child pornography changes our reading of Ed Rooney in Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Whereas the film's original audience wouldn't have had that information available to them, and it wouldn't have contributed to their understanding of the film. In other words, one's reading of a text is dynamic. It depends on the personal sentimentality of the viewer, the culture in which it exists, and to some extent the authorial intention. But didn't you say Barton Foucault wanted to pull the author out of the equation? Sure, they did. However, I would argue both readings are important to better understand a text. Going back to Woody Allen and Annie Hall, if you weren't aware of Allen as a controversial figure in 1977, around the time he was filming Annie Hall, or if you weren't aware, Woody Allen is a controversial figure in 1977, around the time he was filming Annie Hall. Allen was in a romantic relationship with actress Mia Farrow, Allen was in his mid-30s. Farrow's adopted daughter, Soon-Yi Previn, was 7 years old. In the early 1990s, Farrow would find sexualized images of Soon-Yi in Allen's possession, as well as receive accusations from her other children about being assaulted by Allen. In 1997, Woody Allen would marry Soon-Yi and remain together indefinitely. Allen was 62 at the time, Previn was in her 20s. Of course, things are much more complicated than this, and there are a few persuasive documentary films about Allen's abuse, but the point is that Annie Hall's author is wildly problematic. Alvy Singer in the film admits to being somewhat of a deviant, so how much of Allen can we say is represented in his fictional character? And how do we deal with that reading of the film? There's no real answer. However, this is what Barton Foucault are trying to contend with. And another example, J.K. Rowling is known for retroactively altering her Harry Potter books over Twitter. How much of a retcon should we pay attention to? Once a text is created, should the author still have an influence on that text? Does Rowling's public anti-trans rhetoric change the reading of Harry Potter? Of course it does. You can't honestly say it doesn't, but as scholars, we must responsibly read the text. Harry Potter, like Annie Hall, had a major influence on the world in which they exist, so we have to be able to discuss that influence, the author's influence, and the text without the author at all at the same time. Another big example, The Cosby Show, which is a contemporary example in which a text needs to be separated from its author to some extent. The Cosby Show is wildly important for its portrayal of a suburban black family without the shortcomings of stereotypical portrayals common in other television shows during the same period. The show is of great cultural importance, but the author is a monster. So what do? The fourth wall breaks in Annie Hall further throw a wrench in the works. By addressing the audience, these characters, and also in The Cosby Show, are presenting themselves as being partially non-diegetic or outside of the narrative, meaning it's even harder to separate the real person from the fictional character. So, as we transition into Spike Lee's film Do the Right Thing, we'll flip the script a little bit. Like Annie Hall, we have a similar setup where Lee is playing the protagonist, Mookie. However, unlike Annie Hall, Lee's intended reading of the film requires the viewer to connect the events of the film with events in the real world. Do the Right Thing is an example of a film created for the purpose of social activism. In 1989, cell phone cameras weren't a thing. We didn't have a constant stream of real-world events in our face all day like we do today. For this reason, the racially motivated police brutality we see at the end of Do the Right Thing might have been the first time that a mainstream audience was made aware of the state of institutionalized racism in the United States. Throughout the film, unlike in Ferris Bueller or Annie Hall, Mookie and his peers' fourth wall breaks are a form of what's called the oppositional gaze. Like we discussed in our section on the various forms of theory, the term gaze almost always is going to be associated with some form of panoptics, in which the influence of some hegemonic power structure is imposed on an othered population. The oppositional gaze, then, is the reflection of that power onto the oppressor, by having Radio Raheem address the audience with his love-hate speech, or the string of racial slurs spoken directly to the camera by Pino and his peers. The goal is to force the audience to directly engage with a level of racism that exists but is often hidden in polite company or censored in film. Likewise, throughout the film, Smiley, an admittedly poorly aged character, is seen holding up pictures of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King that are largely ignored by the characters throughout the movie until the end, when the racial tension present throughout the narrative comes to a head and both civil rights leaders' philosophies become a functional reality. And the watch guide, I asked you to think about why Mookie asked for the money from Sal. In the same vein, I might ask why Mookie throwing the garbage can through Sal's window is justified. At the conclusion of the film, the tension illustrated by an increasingly hot summer day boils over, and Sal disrupts the equilibrium of the unspoken social contract that allows him to coexist within this community. Not only has Sal misread this equilibrium as a sense of belonging in the community, but he has ignored the active hostility of outsiders like his son towards the actual members of that community. At the end of the film, the peaceful verbal protest by Raheem and Buggin' Out have been ignored or mocked, and Sal's unconscious thoughts are ejaculated verbally, disturbing the equilibrium. As a result, the only option left for the community is the destruction of Sal's pizzeria. Mookie asks for his money the next day because Sal's transgression has nothing to do with the professional exchange of money for Mookie's labor. Like he tells Sal, you know the deal. Afterwards, during the credits, we're giving those two contrasting quotes, further pulling the events of the film into context with the real world. Do the Right Thing isn't the only example of a film as a medium for social activism, but it's one of the more noteworthy examples. Boots Riley's 2018 film, Sorry to Bother You, is a more recent example. In Sorry to Bother You, the audience is confronted with the absurdity of code switching in a late capitalist professional environment. In the film, black characters are required to use a white voice to sell magazines as telemarketers. In the film, the actor's white voice is performed by comedians like David Cross and Patton Oswalt for added comedic effect. In one scene, Riley defines this code switching as pretending to be culturally unburdened to reiterate the dichotomy of racial privilege as opposed to being simply a gag. Code switching is the practice of alternating between two or more languages in conversation. In this case, the switch is tonal cultural signifiers as a way of subverting unconscious forms of racial oppression.